This was not just a war of trenches, mud, and barbed wire. It was not only fought by soldiers clutching rifles in the freezing dark. World War I was also a hidden financial war, a conflict waged in vaults, in bond markets, in quiet government ministries, and in the back rooms of bankers who never heard a single shell explode, but whose decisions shaped the fate of millions. The soldiers fought with steel, the governments fought with money. And behind every attack, every offensive, every month of bloodshed, there were accountants calculating losses, treasuries scrambling for funds, and central banks quietly rewriting the rules of global finance. The truth, the one rarely taught in history books, is that this war reshaped the world's financial system just as brutally as it reshaped its borders. And if you think that what happened in those years has nothing to do with your life today, think again, because the system you live under, the money you earn, the inflation you feel, and the debt your government carries all trace back to this hidden financial battlefield that began in 1914. The story starts with a world that believed itself stable. Europe before the war was a network of alliances, rivalries, and imperial ambition. But beneath the political tension was another reality, a continent bound together by the gold standard. Gold backed every major currency. Gold defined national credibility. Gold forced governments to stay disciplined because they could not print money at will. But when the assassination in Sarajevo set the great powers marching toward conflict, they were also marching toward a financial crisis they did not fully understand. Leaders promised their people that the war would be quick, over within weeks or maybe months. They assumed their gold reserves, their taxes, and their limited borrowing would be enough. Within weeks, they were proven catastrophically wrong. The scale of the fighting, millions of men mobilized, industries converted overnight, weapons demanded at impossible speed, devoured money at a pace Europe had never experienced. Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia all discovered the same terrible truth. The gold would run out long before the war did. And so, in a moment that changed the financial world forever, the great powers began suspending the convertibility of their currencies. Paper money no longer needed to be backed by gold. It was backed only by trust and by desperation. This was the moment modern money was born, not in peace, not in prosperity, but in panic. Germany was the first to fully weaponize finance. Cut off from global markets by the British naval blockade, Berlin turned inward and launched enormous domestic bond campaigns. Real, ordinary citizens, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, were urged to hand over their savings to the state in exchange for war loans, backed by posters showing heroic soldiers and bold promises of repayment after victory. The result was staggering. Multiple rounds of national borrowing that kept the German war machine alive far longer than its gold reserves ever could have. But the foundation was brittle. These bonds were not supported by growing wealth. They were supported by belief. When the war ended in defeat, millions of Germans found that the savings they had sacrificed for the fatherland were worthless, a wound that would fester and become one of the fuels of extremism in the decades ahead. Britain, meanwhile, had one advantage no other nation possessed: the City of London. Before the war, London had been the center of global finance, and sterling was trusted everywhere from India to South America. At first, Britain relied on patriotic domestic borrowing like Germany did, but soon it tapped a deeper reservoir, international capital. And no source proved more important than the United States. Although America remained neutral for the early years of the war, Wall Street bankers quickly saw the opportunity. Firms like J.P. Morgan handled massive loans, coordinated allied purchases of weapons and food, and quietly became the financial backbone of the British and French war efforts. By the time America officially entered the war in 1917, its financial influence had already reshaped the conflict. The United States, once considered a younger, secondary economic power, emerged as the world's dominant creditor. And that transformation, not any single battle, is what made the 20th century the American century. France's financial war looked different. Scarred by memories of earlier defeat and burdened by the enormous cost of building defenses, France leaned heavily on domestic savers, who were famously cautious but deeply patriotic. French citizens bought government bonds in huge numbers. Yet behind the scenes, France also relied on the same rising power that Britain had turned to: American money. This dependence would become a major political issue after the war, as the need to repay debts collided with the need to rebuild. When people talk about the interwar financial chaos, they often mention stock markets or reparations. But the deeper truth is that France entered the 1920s weighed down by the financial decisions made during 4 years of desperation. Russia, on the other hand, descended into financial collapse. The empire was enormous but economically fragile, its banking system underdeveloped, and its infrastructure unable to sustain a modern war. Although Russia possessed significant gold reserves, they were quickly overwhelmed by military losses, inflation, and shortages. The government borrowed heavily from France and Britain, but as defeats mounted and dissatisfaction spread, trust in the ruble evaporated. By 1917, the economic pressure had become unbearable. The Russian monarchy fell, not only because of political failures, but because its financial system had shattered under the strain of a war it could no longer pay for. The revolution that followed was ignited by hunger and fueled by inflation. Again, finances and power marched in lockstep. By 1918, the numbers were almost incomprehensible. The Allied nations had spent more than $100 billion, and the Central Powers around $60 billion, sums that dwarfed anything the world had seen before. The gold standard lay in ruins. Inflation raged. Savings evaporated. And while ordinary people lost homes, livelihoods, and the little wealth they had managed to save, the wealthy often shielded themselves by shifting assets into foreign currencies, precious metals, or global investments. The financial pain of war was not shared equally. It never is. When the guns fell silent, the battlefield expanded into boardrooms and diplomatic halls. America now held the world's largest gold reserves and the world's largest creditor position. Europe, once the financial center of the world, was drowning in debt. Britain owed billions to the United States. France owed billions to Britain and America. Even smaller nations were stuck in obligations they could never hope to repay. And this created a dangerous pressure. If the Allies were to repay their citizens who had bought war bonds, they would have to squeeze reparations out of Germany. The Treaty of Versailles demanded an impossible sum, 132 billion gold marks. It was less a financial plan than a political punishment. Germany could not realistically pay it. Every attempt to meet those reparations destabilized its economy further, until hyperinflation in 1923 destroyed the German currency and shattered middle-class savings. People carried wheelbarrows of notes to buy bread, a symbolic image of financial collapse that still haunts textbooks today. British leaders made a different mistake, attempting to restore the pound to its pre-war value by returning to the gold standard in 1925. But the country's economy had been weakened by war, its industrial competitiveness eroded, and the global balance of power had shifted. Pegging the pound at an unrealistic value forced deep deflation and unemployment, becoming one of the most costly economic errors in British history. And once again, regular workers bore the brunt of it. The United States, now the world's financial superpower, suddenly faced a problem of its own: what to do with all its money. American banks began lending heavily to Germany, allowing Germany to pay reparations to Britain and France, who then sent the same money back across the Atlantic to repay American debts. It was a financial loop that looked stable on the surface, but was actually fragile and unsustainable. When the global economy slid into the Great Depression in 1929, the entire system imploded. What began as a financial war in 1914 had become a global economic crisis 15 years later. And this is why the hidden financial battle behind World War I matters today. It showed governments that they could detach money from reality, print without limit, borrow endlessly, and postpone consequences with promises. It showed that propaganda could turn debt into patriotism, and that citizens could be convinced to sacrifice their savings for bonds that might never be repaid. It showed that economic power could shift not through battles, but through interest rates, loans, and leverage. And it created the modern world's financial DNA, a system built on credit, trust, and illusion. So when your government raises the debt ceiling, when central banks insist inflation is temporary, when new money appears digitally with the tap of a keyboard, remember 1914. Remember the moment when gold ceased to anchor the world. Remember that every financial crisis since, from the Great Depression to 2008, echoes the decisions made in those desperate early months of the war. And remember the harsh lesson history teaches again and again. In financial battles, the wealthy maneuver, the powerful adjust, but the ordinary saver pays the price. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Understand money, question the narrative, and recognize that real wealth, the kind governments cannot inflate away, lies in knowledge, resilience, and independence. History does not lie. It whispers warnings. And the financial war that began in 1914 is still shaping your world today.